So hello once again on a Sunday morning as opposed to a Saturday morning. Forgive me for being 24 hours off schedule, but once again another edition of the partially popular, I guess you could say, 10 minutes on the clock, our weekend recap show. So once again, what's good on the internet, what's good in life? My name is Akeem Balaam, aka Long Island 495. Once again, apologize for the inconvenience that kept me out of commission for yesterday, since I couldn't do 10 minutes on the clock, but I'm back in the saddle again, at least for now, to do our weekend recap show. So let's get right to it, and I want to start by talking about what's going on with Major League Baseball. Of course, the trade deadline is on July 31st, which is about 2.5 weeks away. And of course, with all the talk leading up to the trade deadline, of course there's going to be more talk of the possibility of trading players. And this year is no different. There's a lot of talk about who's going to be traded. There's a lot of talk about perhaps maybe the Philadelphia Phillies, who at this point are, believe it or not, out of the playoff race this year. There's talk that they may wind up trading Cole Hamels, even though Philadelphia Phillies brass, Ruben Amaro Jr. and everybody else, they've actually said in the past that they probably would want to actually keep Cole Hamels in Philadelphia for the foreseeable future. They probably want to make him into their ace pitcher in the face of their franchise going forward, since a lot of other players on the Philadelphia Phillies are aging and are probably pretty daggone close to retirement. And that would include, maybe even Cliff Lee, who hasn't even won a game, didn't even win a game until a few days prior to the All-Star break. So they probably want to re-sign Hamels. A lot of other guys are rumored to be traded. The Atlanta Braves are being said to look at Zach Greinke to bolster their pitching staff. Ryan Dempster of the Chicago Cubs has been one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball this year, but he doesn't get a lot of media press because he pitches for such a bad team, and the Cubs are well out of the playoff race. So I imagine somebody is going to be making a run at Ryan Dempster at the trade deadline. There's talk about Ryan Braun. There's even talk about Cliff Lee. There's mentionings, about the Pittsburgh Pirates perhaps being in the market for Carlos Quentin and Justin Upton. So just another trade deadline in the baseball world. Just another week or so, 2 weeks leading up to the baseball trade deadline, as a lot of guys being rumored to be on the trading block. And certainly, as it seemingly is with every trade deadline, there's always going to be a flurry of deals. It's probably not going to be all that active this week, but the last week leading up to the trade deadline is always active, so it's always going to be very interesting and even fun as well to see exactly who goes forward. I like trade deadlines personally. I like trade deadlines with a lot of action, and usually that's what happens, and I imagine this one is not going to be any different. Moving on to some other stuff. Of course, the NBA free agency period is, of course, going on right now. And one of the big stories that is going on is Jeremy Lin. Linsanity to H-Town? Looks like it, or maybe not. Because it looks like that the reports were that he had indeed agreed to sign the offer sheet that the Houston Rockets had given him. But there's also a report that says that the New York Knicks expectedly were indeed going to match Houston's offer, which you had to expect. They were going to, there was some talk that maybe they were going to either match or up their offer from the Houston Rockets. And there was also talk that perhaps maybe they weren't going to up their offer and match it that the Houston Rockets had offered to them, because there was a deal that they had made for Raymond Felton, who is actually going to be a New York Knick for the second time. But there's talk about if they are going to indeed match the offer sheet that the Rockets had offered, or are they not. But I imagine that they will indeed re-sign this offer sheet, because as I talked about in the previous 10 minutes on the clock video, when I indeed talked about this, Jeremy Lin re-energized Madison Square Garden. I mean, ever since 2000, the last year that they were in the NBA Finals, which I believe it was in the 2000 season, that team, or rather 1999-2000 season, when they lost to the San Antonio Spurs, I believe they got swept by the Spurs that year. The Madison Square Garden was pretty much dead. It was pretty much dead. They had to deal with all the Isaiah Thomas mess, the Isaiah Thomas error, and then all of a sudden they start building up their team. They get better and better each year. And Jeremy Lin, before he went down with that injury, Jeremy Lin was pretty much what New York Knicks fans went on them subways in New York City and all over the tri-state area. That's why they paid those big bucks to see Linsanity. That's why they went to Madison Square Garden, primarily for Linsanity and to experience all that he brought to that team last year. So it was expected, of course, that in my opinion, that they were indeed going to match that offer sheet. But we'll see indeed what happens in the future regarding Jeremy Lin. It looks like he signed the offer sheet, but of course, you had to expect that the New York Knicks were going to match that offer. And speaking of offers and speaking of big contracts, Drew Brees. Huh? Come again? You had to expect that this Drew Brees New Orleans Saints standoff was going to end with Brees signing a big contract. 5 years, $100 million in football money. That's like hitting the jackpot, because as we all know, football money is not as big as, say, basketball money, and it sure as heck is not as big as baseball money. But 5 years, $100 million, that's pretty much the New Orleans Saints saying thank you to Drew Brees for re-energizing this franchise. Thank you, Drew Brees, for everything that you did for New Orleans post-Katrina. Thank you, Drew Brees, for winning a Super Bowl, for bringing a Super Bowl championship down to the Crescent City of New Orleans. And of course, you know, there was the standoff between them and the New Orleans Saints, and there was some stuff that came out also. You know, Drew Brees got some scrutiny, and some of it warranted, you know, but because of the whole Bounty Gate thing, you know, that perhaps he knew just about as much about what was going on with those New Orleans Saints bounties as was Greg Williams and as was Sean Payton, who of course were kicked off for this year. But Drew Brees re-signing with the New Orleans Saints, and re-signing with a big way, 5 years and $100 million. And I believe I read somewhere that somewhere is around $60 to $67 million. He got that just in a signing bonus alone. So to say the least, it was a long standoff, but Drew Brees eventually got what he wanted. He got a long-term deal. He's getting a lot of cash out of it, and likely he is going to retire as a New Orleans Saint and go into the Hall of Fame as a New Orleans Saint as well, because I expect him to keep up the big-time passing numbers that he's been able to amass ever since leaving the San Diego Chargers when they dumped him. They replaced him, of course, with Phillip Rivers, and then Drew Brees went ahead to become an all-time, perhaps you can argue, an all-time and even perhaps Hall of Fame level quarterback in the Crescent City of New Orleans in the Big Easy. And the last story I want to get to is one that's probably burning up the headlines all over across the pond and all over Europe. Here in America, we've been talking about this Joe Paterno story, the fact that the Free Report, the fact that Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier and other Penn State officials were covering up for Jerry Sandusky. That's a big story here, and that's a pretty big story around the world. Of course, that's a big story. But perhaps, if you want to find the equivalent of that story in Europe, look at what happened with FIFA. Because it turns out that, you may not understand this at first, but it turns out that two FIFA officials, or at least two former FIFA officials, somebody by the name of Jean Havelange, who was the former president of FIFA before Sepp Blatter assumed that post, as well as the former executive of football and soccer in the country of Brazil, whose name is Ricardo Teixeira, no relation, of course, to Mark Teixeira, but this guy, Ricardo Teixeira, it turns out, according to documents from a sports marketing company called ISL in Switzerland that is now bankrupt, that ISL had actually paid Mr. Havelange as well as Mr. Teixeira a pretty big amount of money, somewhere in the realm of maybe $13 to $22 million. And this is a big story as well, because you got to remember, these are two officials connected to Brazil, and where is the 2014 World Cup going to be held in a few years? That's right, in Brazil. And of course they used that to get the 2016 Olympics as well, but also a pretty big dang on story, the fact that you had people in FIFA taking bribes from this sports marketing company, and they used that pretty much to buy the World Cup and determine where the World Cup was going to be held. There's also similar stories that the 2018 and the 2022 World Cup were also may have influenced by under the table money from coming to and from Russia and Qatar, as well as a lot of other places. So that's your 10 minutes on the clock. I guess you can say, I wouldn't say rushed, but certainly not to the quality that I'm used to for doing our weekend recap show, but certainly a lot of stories to get to. So what do you think about this? Rate, comment, react, reply, add, and subscribe. Look forward to reading your comments. As always, I'm just one guy talking about nothing. It's early Sunday morning, and I just woke up, so you can imagine I am dog tired. So let me go and cut a few more Z's. Until next time, I'm just one guy talking about nothing. I'm Li495, aka Akeem Balaam. 10 minutes on the clock on the Real Sports Talk. See you on the internet somewhere.